Hi, this is Ed Fitzpatrick. If you enjoy local politics as much as I do, be sure to join our friends at Rhode Island PBS for the show A Lively Experiment. Hosted by Jim Hummel, the weekly series features journalists, pundits, and politicians debating the stories and issues that matter most to us Rhode Islanders. Tune in to A Lively Experiment and be part of the conversation. Fridays at 7 p.m. on Rhode Island PBS and wherever you get your podcasts. From the Boston Globe, this is Rhode Island Report. I'm Ed Fitzpatrick. Welcome back to the podcast where we bring you big conversations from our very small state. More than 200 years ago, Jamestown, Rhode Island had the largest percentage of enslaved people in the state. What happened to the Black community there? Their stories have never been told, but a local historian is working to change that. That's just one segment in the most recent episode of the Our Town series on Rhode Island PBS. Arts and culture producer Ross Lippman pulled together this segment, and he's here to tell us more about it. Ross Lippman, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So first, tell us about the Our Town series on Rhode Island PBS. How does it work?
Our Town is a series that has been on the air at Rhode Island PBS for 10 years. 2024 marks its 10th year. The goal of Our Town is to visit every town in Rhode Island and create an episode dedicated to that town, celebrating its history, celebrating its community, celebrating the people that make the town unique. And the way in which we really address this in the show is by putting the storytelling in the hands of the residents of the town. So when a town is announced, we reach out to the community and say, we are making this show and we want you to tell your stories on the program. As a result of that, we receive a series of stories submitted for every town, and then they become storytellers and filmmakers themselves. We work alongside them to help develop their story ideas, give them suggestions about what it is that they can film in order to make their stories possible in video form. They provide us all of that, and then we put together roughly an hour-long program dedicated to each town in Rhode Island. And the most recent episode, which is Jamestown, is our 18th town in the series.
So how does it work with the community members who want to contribute to the Our Town series?
So it's a multi-step process. We first reach out to the community through generally local newspapers. We will email organizations that we think have connections to people who want to tell stories for the show. After that, we have a couple of Zoom meetings where we tell people about the show, how it works, what would be asked of them in volunteering their time to make their story possible. We make camera equipment available in town for every town that we go to. So if you're a resident and you want to borrow camera equipment, it's available generally at the town's library is where we place it. It's a central location. Everyone knows how to get there. We also accept people to use their cell phones. It's 2024. A lot of cell phones are just as good or if not better than some cameras. And so as long as they're meeting our guidelines for how to film their stories, then that's an acceptable way. Generally, Our Town is looking back to the past. So it's gathering all of the historical videos, pictures, documents that would support your story as well. So it's a bit of forward thinking. What do I need to film? What do I need to take pictures of for my story? And then also looking back, what do I already have? What's important historically to also be included in my story?
So 18 towns have already done it, and Jamestown has a two-part series, correct?
That's right.
Are they usually two parts?
No. So this was a first time for Our Town. There was such a strong amount of interest in Jamestown from the community that we received so many story ideas for the episode that we decided to do two parts. So the first part aired in September. Part 2 for Our Town Jamestown airs on December 11th. So by the time that folks hear this, it will already have aired and will be airing frequently over the next few weeks before the holidays.
We got to see a little bit of part 2, and it was a very interesting story from Valerie Southern.
I'm a person of color, and for some reason, the history of people of color, Native Americans, Blacks, Portuguese, etc., those histories are not being discussed.
Can you tell us about her?
So Valerie Southern is a Jamestown resident. She grew up on Jamestown and wanted to bring to light the history of the Black community on the island in a way that she felt like had not been done previously.
I've joined another local resident, Peter Fay, and we've written a book soon to be published called A Peaceful Patch of Earth, Blacks in Jamestown, Rhode Island, in a time of racial turbulence in America, 1850 to 1920.
So if you think about that time period, this is the Civil War, the passage of the 13th Amendment, and all of the series of events that follow, not only in our current corner of the country in New England, but across the country for Black folks. Valerie reached out to me. I remember speaking to her on the phone and learning about the book that she was writing and knowing that it was an important story to have on the program, provided she wanted to share it with us, to the point that we decided to follow along and filmed with her in order to ensure that the story met the standard that not only she was hoping for, but also honored the history that she was telling. So Valerie chose to share with us 4 passages in particular from her book, sort of to serve as 4 touchstones for what the experiences were like for different individuals at that time.
Hannah Elizabeth Champlin was born free in Jamestown. She lived her entire life in Jamestown and died quietly on the island at age 67. Hannah lived through and was likely fearful of the prevalence of slavery, the turmoil of the Civil War, the horrifying assassination of President Lincoln, and the astounding 1865 passage of the 13th Amendment. The Champlin family farm was the first farm in Jamestown owned by a family of color. Moreover, land ownership afforded the male members of the family the right to vote.
What's the percentage of people who are people of color on Jamestown throughout history? Is it a big percentage?
Valerie does speak to this.
The island at one time held the largest percentage of enslaved persons of any town in New England.
And so the population for Black folks in Jamestown has varied over the years, but for the time period that she is speaking to, that was of particular note.
And she talks about going to the Mount Zion AME church on the island when she was a kid, right?
She grew up in Jamestown and she went to this church when she was young.
Mount Zion AME Church, established in 1896 with the Reverend William H. Thomas as deacon. So here it stood for 138 years. Its first 100 years as a church for the island Black community.
She would go to church with her mom on Sundays.
By that time, only 3 or 4 Black residents attended. The glory days were gone, and now as I reflect, I'm glad that she insisted that I attend. I was sitting in a special place, and in my youth, I was unaware of its significance.
And I think for her, being able to do the investigation and the research necessary to get this story written, this book written, she now feels like she has a better perspective and appreciation for not just places like the church, but other touchstones in Jamestown that speak to the rich history of Black folks on the island.
And I was really interested in the person she mentioned who was a Buffalo soldier who lived on the island.
Yeah, Benjamin Morrell.
Benjamin Morrell was born enslaved in 1847 in Madison County, Kentucky. His life was remarkable.
He navigated a life where at one point he was enslaved, then a member of the Army.
And retired in Jamestown with his wife to create a hospitality enterprise. For at least a decade, it became the getaway resort for Black dignitaries across the nation.
As we all know, Jamestown is a great place to visit in the summer, and what we may not consider is how difficult it would have been to be a Black person wanting to do this during that particular period of time. So Sergeant Morrell and his wife created a safe space for people to come and visit. And so his legacy it's varied and it's vast. And again, he's just one of several people that are talked about in this story.
And she also mentioned the first woman of color to register and vote in Jamestown, right?
Yes, Olivia Johns Rice. She lived to be 93 years old.
Olivia Johns Rice comes from a storied family of civil rights champions and landowners. In 1920, she was one of the first women of color on the island to register and vote.
She is considered a hero to many because of the work that she did, and the home that she grew up in still exists on the island today and is actually owned by somebody who was a part of the first part of our town, Jamestown. So it's just interesting to see how everything ties together, and the community is very tight-knit even over the years.
In the episode, Valerie Southern mentions that for some reason, the history of people of color, their histories are not being discussed, but it sounds like the Jamestown Historical Society is starting to address that, right?
Yes, I think as many organizations are appropriately being mindful of how to be more diverse and inclusive in not only their storytelling, but in the keeping of history of places. The Jamestown Historical Society, which was a part of the first part of our town, Jamestown, is also making efforts to do the same.
It sounds like part of that effort will also be looking at the indigenous people that lived there for so long before the colonists came over, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is my second town as the producer for our town, but in many of the most recent episodes I've seen, when we detail the history of the town at the very beginning of the episode, we give like a very brief history of the town. It's always important to acknowledge who was on these lands originally and what it was that they were doing during that time. And so that's a very important thing, not only to people trying to preserve history in many of these towns, but to us as a program.
We'll have more after a quick break. When you want to go beyond the headlines, let me recommend Rhode Island PBS Weekly. Rhode Island PBS Weekly is an award-winning news magazine broadcast that gives you the full story, powered by investigative journalism and narrative storytelling. New episodes of Rhode Island PBS Weekly drop Sundays at 7:30 p.m. on Rhode Island PBS. Watch past episodes at ripbs.org/weekly. That's ripbs.org/weekly. That first episode talks about Beavertail Lighthouse, which anyone who knows Jamestown will recognize. Can you tell us a bit about the history of that lighthouse?
The lighthouse is one of the original lighthouses that was erected along the coast of New England, and it was important to guiding ships through Narragansett Bay. It had a very important role on the island when the island was very sealed off to the rest of the state. It wasn't until years and years later that the bridges were built connecting Jamestown to the rest of the state.
Yeah, that's one thing that surprised me about that episode was how recent the bridges are.
Yeah, right. So there's the Newport Bridge,
right,
and then there's the Jamestown-Verrazano Bridge. And even I've been living in Rhode Island for 3 years. I don't think of Jamestown in any other way other than that there are these bridges that are necessary to get to whether it be Jamestown or Newport. In part 2 of our town, Jamestown, there is a story about a family's experience on the island before the bridges were built. Life in Jamestown was very different. The ferry played an essential role. If you wanted to go from Jamestown to Newport, the ferry was the way to do it. And life was slower as a result. The businesses on the island were more important as a result. This particular storyteller said something like, there's 5 grocery stores, 2 gas stations, a hardware store, and everything you needed was on the island. And I think that is still true today. But when the bridges were built, it was a seismic shift on what life was like on the island.
And it seemed to underscore how coastal defense has been such a big part, not just of Jamestown's history, but the whole Rhode Island coast, right?
And I think if you think about many of these island communities or the coastal communities in Rhode Island, the purpose of why people went there was much more utilitarian previously. So Jamestown, for example, many people were there because they were either working in some line of work where it was like fishing or shipping or boats, something to that effect. And then once the bridges are built and the landscape of how our economy is structured changes, a lot of people now, if you were to ask them, why did you move to Jamestown, their probably less likely to say, I moved to Jamestown for job XYZ. I moved to Jamestown because it's a great place to live, or I moved to Jamestown because it affords me and my family a better life.
What did you learn about Jamestown that surprised you?
The biggest thing is just how enthusiastic the community is about its history, and it's an extremely tight-knit community. So many people were interested in sharing stories for our town, Jamestown, more interest than we've ever received for the show.
How many people live in Jamestown, roughly?
I want to say it's 5,500, just south of 6,000 people. And if you think about our show, the fact that we had nearly 30 people interested in sharing stories for the show, and ultimately 22 stories across the two parts, that's a lot of people who really care about Jamestown. And if every town had people in it that were really passionate about oral tradition and preserving it, we would have so much history about Rhode Island that comes from a unique perspective, that being the perspective of those living in the places. The Globe and Rhode Island PBS and the Public's Radio offer a very important service in terms of storytelling, but there's also that first-person perspective that we could never get otherwise.
So what is the next town you'll focus on in the Our Town series?
Our town will move to Barrington for its 19th town. We are already working with people in the community there for stories. So from my end, we end up working with the residents in town who want to share stories on the show from anywhere between 9 to 12 months usually. It depends on, the length of time from when we first reach out to everyone to when the episode airs. So we've already had our outreach in Barrington, and we have our list of storytellers for the episode. Right now it's at about a dozen, which is pretty consistent with what most Our Town episodes look like. And so those dozen storytellers are filming things for their stories, and I'm hopping on the phone with people to, bounce ideas with them about what it is that they're trying to film, how to best capture the things that they're looking for in the episode. And Our Town Barrington is scheduled to air in September of 2025.
Are you still accepting input from people if anybody was interested?
We have a deadline for when the story submissions needed to be sent. We've already passed that deadline, but what I always say is that something that's very important to us is if someone feels passionate enough about a story, that they're more than welcome to reach out and let us know what that story is, and we would gladly take into consideration, but we do have like a time period that we generally field stories for.
All right, Ross Lippman, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
You can watch the Our Town episode about Jamestown at ripbs.org/ourtown. Rhode Island Report is a production of the Boston Globe in collaboration with Rhode Island PBS. Today's episode was produced by Megan Hall. Audio mixing and mastering by Marissa Ewing of Hemlock Creek Productions. Our music is from APM. Be sure to follow us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. I'm Ed Fitzpatrick. See you next week. Looking to binge watch all your favorite PBS shows? You need Rhode Island PBS Passport. Masterpiece, Antiques Roadshow, Rhode Island PBS Weekly, and many more. Watch them all, anytime, and from any streaming device. Learn more about this member benefit at ripbs.org/passport. That's ripbs.org/passport.